Between June 2016 and May 2017, there were 32,953 crimes committed in Brighton, but most frequently reported were antisocial behaviour, violent crime and other theft. To try and gain an understanding of why crime levels are so high, we spoke to Peter Squires, a criminologist at the University of Brighton.
If you ask criminologists to look into their crystal balls and say, why does it go up and why does it go down, you'll get a variety of different explanations. At the moment, the assumption is that it's going up because the police are facing cuts, they're not as visible, forming a kind of deterrence on the streets. And that's seen to be a kind of major critique of the government, police numbers.
With the levels of crime being so high in the city, there will obviously be issues of safety to the public. Do the public feel safe in Brighton? We interviewed Callum, an 18-year-old who has lived in the area all his life, to gain a public perspective of crime in Brighton.
It's not as big of an issue as people like to think it is. Some people like to think that Whitehawk is the equivalent to Croydon or South London, and that violence is at an all-time high, but it's not as bad as people like to think. But I don't feel comfortable walking the streets at night on my own.
What causes a person to feel the need to commit a crime, and what is the effect on the victim and the perpetrator? Hannah Cassidy, a psychologist at the University of Brighton, gives us an insight to the mentality behind crime.
If you read the newspaper, or you watch TV, or you watch films, it would lead you to suggest that people who commit violent crimes are likely to have mental health issues. Because it's often portrayed as the person committing these violent crimes is in some form of psychoses. But actually, if you look at the figures, particularly when it comes to being a victim, people with mental health issues are more likely to be a victim of violent assault than anyone else in the general population.
We then went on to ask what factors cause crime in Brighton.
I think we often think of crime as a sort of as a consequence of social factors, but I think you've got to add into that cultural factors, the way people feel about who they are and where they are. So I think one of the biggest changes in recent years has been the recognition of hate crime, whether it's race-based hatred, whether it's refugee-based hatred, whether it's homophobic intolerances, whether it's sexist violence. I mean, all manifestations of hate or discrimination or prejudice. And I think we've been taking those much more seriously.
Okay, suppose Brighton could be considered, or recreational drug use in Brighton could be considered a potential trigger to an increase in violent crime, but there's so much more going on around it because it can be counteracted by the fact that people know that the police know that there's a link between those things, so they actively try and counteract it.
But the concern at the moment is about violence, and I think that violence in public places, around nightclubs, around pubs, it's invariably alcohol related, or it's gang related, or it's drug deal related. And I think that's clearly got something to do with a diminishing police visible presence.
It's not easy to say that definitely those two things are linked without comparing Brighton to perhaps another area which doesn't have as much recreational drug use, for example. You'd have to try and do several comparisons to find out if it's that aspect of Brighton's nightlife that is creating an increase in violent crime.
To see the effect of crime on the victim, we spoke to someone who has been a victim of crime in the past. Due to the sensitive nature of the situation, they wish to remain anonymous.
I'm 16.
Where did it happen?
There's a tunnel at the top of Elm Grove that's between the garden centre and Whitehawk.
Tell us about the violent incident.
I was walking home from a friend's house. It was probably about 10 o'clock at night. And I was in a tunnel, which is kind of the way I walked that way from school as well. And this guy came up behind me, grabbed me and tried to take my phone, but before he could do anything else, I somehow pushed him off and ran.
Has this incident had any impact on your life at all?
Yeah, I mean, for about 6 months afterwards, I wouldn't walk home alone at night, and still to this day, when I do, I feel really anxious about it, and I have to put my headphones in or something, just kind of zen myself out.
Did you report it?
No, I didn't.
What was that?
Because those things happen all the time, and because I didn't see his face or anything, nothing would have come out of it anyway.
Do you feel safer now?
Kind of. I ended up taking self-defense lessons, so I'm a bit more prepared if it ever happened again, but
You shouldn't have to be prepared though, should you?
I know, but it's even being prepared. If I hadn't pushed him off, he could have pulled out a knife or something, and something else could have happened.
As students at the University of Brighton, this exploration into levels of crime in the city have provided us with an insight as to how much of an issue crime is. So, if you have ever been affected by crime and would like some advice on where to go next, please contact the numbers shown on screen.